Well, hello and welcome to this National IoD event, Building Resilience Against Cyber Risk. My name is Joe Fitzsimons. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor here at the IoD. And today we're delighted to be joined by Gareth Wharton, Cyber CEO at Hiscox, and Stephen Ridley, Cyber Underwriting Manager at Hiscox UK. And so today we're going to be discussing what the current cyber risks that businesses are facing are and how they can be managed. Hiscox have been doing some phenomenal work in this area, and the 5th annual International Hiscox Cyber Readiness Report provides an up-to-the-minute picture of cyber readiness for organizations. Gareth and Stephen will be telling us a lot more about that very shortly. But first, I'm keen to highlight some of the work, some of the research that we've been conducting in the IoD's Policy and Corporate Governance Unit over the past few months. If I could have the next slide, please. So, as I say, my name is Joe Fitzsimons, and I'm a member of that Policy and Corporate Governance Unit. And so we asked a few questions back in September of last year. And so we surveyed about 950 members at that point, and we asked, relative to before the pandemic, which of the following best describes their organization's intended level of workplace use in the longer term? And as we can see from the results here, more than half of those that we polled said that their organization intended to reduce their long-term use of workplaces. And more than 1 in 5 reported that their usage would be significantly lower. So this is a really clear message, really clear trend that we're seeing develop, and something that we're watching very closely. If I could have the next slide, please. We also asked about changes that they had made to their work, to their organization due to the pandemic, that they plan to keep in place longer term. And as you can see from the results here, increased working from home, about 74% of members indicated that that would be one for them, that being about 3/4 of respondents. So again, a really clear message here. Moving operations to digital platforms, about 26%, increased flexible working, staggered approaches to working, about 43%. So this big trend in terms of new ways of working and hybrid approaches, something that, again, we're continuing to monitor very closely. If I could have the next slide, please. So we know that these new ways of working have a big impact on cyber risk for organizations. Now, more recently, in February of this year, we were surveying about 800 IoD members. And we asked, compared to before the pandemic, does your organization feel more vulnerable or less vulnerable to cyber crime? Now, about 1 in 3 members, as we can see here, indicated that they feel either more or significantly more vulnerable now than before the pandemic, with only 3% of our members indicating that they feel less vulnerable. So this sharp rise in home working as a result of the pandemic has definitely meant that businesses have become more exposed to cyber risks and cyber threats. And so this is something that we're trying to support our members on as much as we can. And we know how big the issue is. If I could have the next slide, please. So really just a few comments on this from an IoD perspective. As I say, we know that increased home working has made navigating cybersecurity that bit more challenging. And indeed, the way that we've had to move during the pandemic and do it pretty much overnight has made that more challenging again. Organizations have unfortunately suffered from cyber attacks over the course of the pandemic. And many organizations, as I say, 1/3 of our members are feeling more vulnerable now than before the pandemic. They can cause significant disruption, loss of revenue, and unfortunately, in many cases, data theft, and the potential for reputational damage is really, really significant. So minimizing the risks of cybercrime will continue to be a front of mind priority for our members and indeed for all business leaders. And so before I hand over to our first speaker, we have some very brief polls that we'd like to run with you all now. And hopefully this will be a way for you to share your views. So you'll see the first poll appearing on your screen very shortly. And I'd be very grateful if you could respond to that poll. And so the question, as you'll see, is, have you had a cyber attack in the past 12 months? And the options here are yes, no, or I don't know. So we'll pause now just for a moment to give you an opportunity to respond to that particular survey. And also just to say, we have a Q&A at the end of today's session. So you'll see there's a Q&A button in your window. So please do submit any questions that you have as we move through using that Q&A, and we'll look to answer those at the end of today's session. So we'll just give you another moment on this poll. And so I think we're going to close this poll any moment now. So we can go ahead and close that, and you'll see the results imminently. So have you suffered a cyber attack in the last 12 months? And we can see here that 22% of the people who've completed the poll have said yes. So that's quite significant. Now, I won't go into much more detail here, because what I'd like to do is allow Hiscox to compare this data with the data they've been gathering themselves and tell us how they compare. But we have a second poll that I'd like to run with you, and you'll see the question for that second poll appear on your screen any moment now. And so the question this time is, do you have a clear view of how cybersecurity is being managed at your organization? And again, the options are yes, no, or I don't know. So we'll pause just for a moment to allow you to answer that poll as well. Okay, and I think we'll go ahead and close that poll any moment now, and you'll see the result appear on your screen. And so the question was, do you have a clear view of how cybersecurity is being managed at your organization? Now, 76% of people have said yes here, but 19% are saying no, and 5% saying I don't know. So about a quarter of people either know or don't know there. So again, I will let Hiscox, fantastic speakers, comment on this and compare it to the data they've gathered. And so without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our first session. And so that session is Current Cyber Risks for Business, and that's going to be delivered by Gareth Wharton, the Cyber CEO at Hiscox. Over to you, Gareth.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Joe has said, my name is Gareth Wharton. I'm the Cyber CEO at Hiscox. I've been at Hiscox 15 years. Most of that time I've spent in our technology department, working as the CTO. And then in 2017, I jumped into the cyber insurance teams, and I run a team at the centre of Hiscox, helping Steve and his colleagues around the world sell cyber insurance and improve the cyber resilience of all our customers. Okay, I get to channel my inner Chris Whitty and utter that immortal phrase. Next slide, please. Okay, so just reflecting on our first poll, so from our Cyber Readiness Report this year, in the UK, we found 36% of the respondents had had at least one attack. That was up from 30% last year. And this is the UK stats, which compares to 43% for the full cohort in the readiness report. So it's pleasing to say that only 22% of our respondents said they'd had an attack. So obviously, as you'd expect, IoD members are better at protecting themselves than the wider UK business population. But I think what this does show is that, you know, whichever number you take there, either the stat we've just seen from everybody that's kindly responded here, 1 in 5 people, or here it's sort of 1 in 3 or 2 in 5 from the wider community. We looked at some stats from the UK ONS around burglary and fire in commercial properties. The chance of your commercial property being burgled is about 1%, and the chance of having a fire is about 0.5%. So between the two of them, there's a 1.5% chance of that, whereas we're seeing 20% from your response or 36% here. So I think it just shows the relative risk of a cyber attack relative to more traditional bricks and mortar type attack. So my job here is totally not to scaremonger. It is to just make sure that the cyber threat is better understood. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So this is a clear view of how cybersecurity is being managed. So you can see from the 2020 to 2021 report, there was a slight reduction in that number. And I think that's fully explainable by COVID. Business risk changed significantly in 2021. I think it's a year we'll look back and see very few others that are similar. But a lot of companies, as Joe was saying in his earlier session, from the work that the IoD have done, lots of remote working, which provides lots of IT challenges, having to set up remote access systems. So naturally, there's a new technology into organizations, which perhaps less well known than previous technologies. So it's not a surprise to see that number go down. but it's positive to see that 76% of our respondents say that they're on top of things. And I'm sure we've all faced challenges over the past year. Okay, so we're going to dive into a few of the slides that we've prepared around the current cyber challenge. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So as I'm sure a lot of you will have heard, there was a large Microsoft Exchange vulnerability about a couple of months ago. And these are some stats internally from Hiscox customers. So Microsoft, as like they do with many software, release different versions. So Microsoft Exchange, their flagship email program. So you can see the versions that are available. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at Exchange 2010, which is a decade old, and we've had 3 subsequent versions to it, 53% of companies running Exchange, of our customers running Exchange 2010 are running an out-of-date version. And even for the newer 3 versions, still a quarter of customers are running an out-of-date version. Now, Exchange, as I'm sure everybody's aware, is part of the crown jewels. It's where your email lives. It's super tightly connected with Active Directory in the core of your network. So any compromise of Exchange will give the hackers near full control of your organization. If nothing else, it will give them incredible intel about who does what in the organization and what roles they play. So keeping Exchange patched, I would see as a critical piece of infrastructure in your estate. So to see numbers like this is quite concerning. And I think the message for me, or that I would like to get across here, is that cyber is a complex risk. There's no doubt about it, but it's not an impossible risk. Doing the simple things well will stand you in much better stead. So these critical internet-facing bits of infrastructure, these should be a priority for you to keep patched and up to date. And just to reinforce that, if we move on to the next slide. So this slide is again the breakdown of our Exchange 2013 estate. And while you can see the vast majority of customers are on the latest version, there's nearly 1,000 customers or 1,000 servers that are 7 years out of date. Now, Exchange 2013 was available 8 years ago, so it's likely that those installs at 7 years old were commissioned in 2013 or 2014 and then have just never been upgraded there since then. So I think that shows you the state that some people leave unpatched servers, and this is for me this is an unacceptable risk. This is if you're not patching your servers, or it's not like updating your iPhone or keeping Chrome up to date on your browser, this is a huge risk. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So recently the US government put out this advisory that the Russian states are targeting US networks. And then on the right hand side is a list of vulnerabilities. Now, you don't need to know about the vulnerability database, but the first set of numbers next to the word CVE are the year the vulnerability was found. And you can see there's 1 from 2018, 3 from 2019, and 1 for 2020. So these are the top 5 risks that the US government say companies are coming under. And I think the key point here is every single one of those is over 6 months old. So while, as I said, cyber is a complex business, these things are all eminently preventable. These are attacks that really a good organization should be preventing from happening. So I think the point is, simple things can make you a far more secure customer and much less vulnerable to some of the common threats we see. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Cyber Readiness Report and some of the things we found. If we move on to the next slide. So, as I said at the top, the increase of companies that are attacked from 38 to 45%. But there are some positive stories here. So what we definitely saw last year was a significant jump in IT budget, or the percentage of IT budget that's spent on cybersecurity. So most companies now are spending about 1/5 of their budget on cybersecurity. So I think this is a really interesting data point. As I said, I used to be a CTO. It's always useful to get a benchmark of spending. And I think companies have, everybody's had a tough year in 2020. So budgets have been restrained. We've seen companies say we're going to take on less change, but it is still a positive sign that cybersecurity spend has gone up. But there are some less positive things. 1 in 6 companies got hit with a ransomware attack, and 1 in 6 companies said that their survival was threatened as a result of the attack. So I think it just shows the breadth and the danger of cyber attacks that are out there. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, so building cyber resilience. So what we categorize, and I'll come on and talk about this in a later session, we qualify companies as experts or intermediates or novices according to their cyber readiness. And I think a key piece here is on this piece on the top right, that experts had fewer attacks, they were less likely to pay ransoms, and they recovered more quickly. I think we're getting to a stage where cybersecurity is becoming a business advantage. If you're less likely to be attacked, or you don't get attacked and your competitors do, this stands you in significantly better stead. So this is not just really a cost of doing business, this is an active business advantage these days. And then on the top left, cyber readiness our model is built on this people, process, and technology. It's really, really easy to buy technology, but changing people and changing process is much more difficult. So this holistic approach is a really important thing. And you heard me quote some stats around fire and burglary. We still see insurance take-up is very, very slow. So it was 26% last year, and it's only crept up to 27% this year. Now, Steve's going to talk more about the insurance side of things, but I think cyber risk, it needs to be a mix of risk reduction and risk transfer. You can only reduce the risk so far, and then at some point it just makes better sense to take up a risk transfer solution. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is just talking about the companies that had a ransomware attack. And this was showing like 1 in 6 companies had it. So interesting to see the split of companies that did pay a ransom and didn't. This would suggest to me that our Irish and Dutch and Spanish colleagues are better at data backups and therefore didn't need to resort to paying a ransom attack. Right, let's move on to the next slide. So what's interesting from the companies that had a ransomware attack is on the right-hand side here, it says phishing emails were the #1 way in for extortionists. 2/3 mentioned this method of entry. I think last year was a particularly bad year for spam with the coronavirus pandemic. There was a thirst for information. People didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to respond to it. So they were more likely to click on emails. There was this thirst for information, which meant people were more likely to click on emails that perhaps they wouldn't have done. And I think removing the physical proximity of being in an office, you didn't have a colleague to turn around and go, did you get this email? Does this look right to you? Also meant that people clicked on more emails than they had have done previously. So I think it's not surprising to see this stat, but it is slightly in contrast to the Hiscox stats. And then on the left-hand side, you can see just over half of those targeted paid the ransom. We are definitely seeing a change in ransomware attack tactics, whereas especially when they're targeting larger organizations, it's not only the extortion with the encryption of the data, it's the theft of the data and trying to extort the value of that data to the customer is what we're seeing as a much more prevalent tactic. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So this is from our claims report, and we see something slightly different to the stats in the readiness report. So last year, remote access was 63% of attacks. So a lot of companies set up Microsoft's standard remote access protocol called Remote Desktop Protocol, which is very easy to attack with what's called a brute force attack to try and guess different passwords. So that was nearly 2/3 of attacks we found came in that way. Again, VPN attacks. So there was lots of software vulnerabilities found in popular VPN software last year. So that's a common entry. And again, phishing emails. So those are really the top 3 that we saw last year. Okay, if we can move on. So it's the last slide in this section for me. The watch list. So a lot of these, unfortunately, we wrote this last year, these have started to come to life. So software supply chains as targets. We've seen the SolarWinds attack earlier in the year, and we saw the Microsoft Exchange attack. We've seen some smaller ones as well. There was a code development company had one last week. This is a particularly nasty type of attack and very difficult to detect because it's often not within your gift to protect yourself against these attacks. But there are things you can do about this. So look at who are your key suppliers. If this supplier went pop, what impact would it have on my business? So thinking about contingency plans for that specific supply chain. And also, if they are critical suppliers to you, ask them about their security standards, ask them what cyber accreditations they hold. We've definitely seen the evolution of ransomware, denial of service, and doxing, where data is released onto the dark web. And as we've said, as I've just mentioned, RDP ports and remote access are key points of entry. COVID, I think, will still be a threat. Healthcare, local government, vaccine distributors, all very popular sites. And this final one, the legal landscape shifting as we start to see GDPR fines. We'll definitely be seeing more breaches around this, and Steve may talk more about this in his section. So I'm going to hand back to Joe for another poll, and we'll carry on after that.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gareth. Fascinating, particularly interesting to hear you mentioned the increase in spam over the past year. I think we can all relate to that, and hopefully we've not fallen victim at any point. So we have another poll for you all now. You'll see it appear on your screen in just a moment. And the question this time is, does your business have a tested disaster recovery and business continuity plans? So it's yes, no, or don't know again. And just to remind you all while you're replying there, thank you to those of you who have submitted questions in the Q&A function. Please do continue to send through your questions during the various sessions, and we will be looking to answer those at the end of today's event. So I think we'll close that poll any moment now, and you'll see the result appear on your screen shortly. So does your business have a tested disaster recovery and business continuity plans? And so about 76% of people have said yes here, but about 19% saying no and 5% saying I don't know. So very interesting result there. And I'm going to hand you back over to Gareth for our second session of the day, and that's what we can learn from cyber readiness experts. Over to you, Gareth.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, please. And you already know who I am. So, right. So, interestingly, 76% said we do have a tested business continuity plan. So, we use the COBIT answers for how we judge whether customers are experts or novices, and they have these, as you can see along the bottom, defined, measured, optimized. So I think we consider those last three as have a well-organized DR plan or business continuity plan, and that I think is similar sort of numbers. That's about 70% in my book, so 76% from respondents. So that's a very positive sign. I think even though historically disaster recovery is becoming less of a focus and cyber is becoming more of a focus for IT teams, they are largely two sides of the same coin. So the ability to respond in the event of a cyber attack is crucial, and be that whether your data center becomes unavailable or an office becomes unavailable or you're a ransomware attack, having a well-managed business continuity plan is key. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. So this year we did, and sorry, this is a bit of a sales pitch on this slide. This year we did something different with our cyber readiness model. So one of the things, the cyber readiness research, we have 6,000 companies across 9 countries fill in the research. And what we really wanted to do is make this data accessible. As I said earlier, I used to be a CTO, and I was constantly trying to learn what my competitors are doing, what my peers were doing, what a benchmark of what we were doing was. So this year we've moved our readiness report online. So you can see the link at the bottom of the page. I'm sure your IT teams tell you not to click on QR codes you don't know, but that QR code is the same link to the one below it, I promise. This is a free online cyber maturity model. You take the questionnaire. There's about 45 questions in it, so it is quite thorough. It's not a 5-minute job, so there is a bit of investment in your time. But on the flip side, what this will show you is on these 6 domains where you fit on a 1 to 5 scale. But I think probably one of the most useful things is you can compare it to your peers. So you can compare yourself to companies that have a similar employee count, they're in the same industry as you and in the same country as you. So you can drill down and go, where do I stand against my peers? And as an ex-CTO, I found that useful in sometimes justifying cybersecurity spend and where we're strong and where we were weak. So this is available for free. You can just sign up using the link below. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, what I wanted to just call out here is we rated customers, as I alluded to previously, as novices, intermediates, and experts across these 6 domains on the left, and then people, process, and technology. And I think what's clear is The more traditional domains, things like business resilience management and threat and vulnerability management, which were still things before cyber was really number one, these tend to be the highest scores. So threat and vulnerability management, are you good at antivirus? Do you have firewalls? These sorts of things. And business resilience management, the disaster recovery and business continuity we've just talked about. Even for novices, this is typically where they score highest. Cryptography and key management is where we score least well. This is a pretty advanced area and one that even the experts score lower on. And then I think if you look at the numbers, you can see that technology numbers are sometimes considerably higher than the people and process. As I said to earlier, it's easy to buy technology, but implementing it and changing the culture of an organization is considerably more difficult. So if we look at these scores, they're mostly in the ones, or between 1 and 2. So if we flick to the next slide and we look at experts, so you can see from the experts here, the scores are significantly higher. We're up in the 4s. So this just shows that it is possible to be good at these things. And it does show the difference. I think, as I alluded to earlier, the difference that experts have fewer attacks, they can respond more quickly, and they have to pay a ransom less frequently, are key pieces. And I really, as I said before, do see this as a business advantage. So for me, making yourself a cyber expert is a key piece of the puzzle here. Okay, if we move on, this is the last slide I've got in this section. This is looking at the UK stats for where cyber novices, cyber intermediates, and cyber experts stand. Not surprisingly, the biggest chunk of novices are in the very smallest organisations. We tend to find that organisations won't have an IT person until they're about 25 people strong, and they won't have an IT security person until they're around 100 strong. So it's not at all a surprise to see the percentage of novices being much higher in the smaller employees category. And then as you go up, as you would expect, the percentage that become intermediates or experts gets bigger and bigger as the company size increases, which is as you would expect. It's interesting, we look at that 250 to 999 sector as an area where a company typically is going through very rapid growth and can be an area where companies can be vulnerable because they are growing faster than they have the people and the process and the technology to cope with. So that's we tend to find that the small companies are generally novices, the larger companies tend to be experts, but they can be, as that company goes through its growing phase of that 200, 500,000 staff, that the technology and the security and the process, the governance side of the organization takes time to catch up. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there and pass back to Joe.
That's great. Thanks very much, Gareth. Fantastic stuff. Again, if anyone has any questions, please do continue. We've been receiving lots of questions through the Q&A function there, so please do continue to send those through. So we have a further poll for you now, which you'll see appear on your screen in the next couple of moments. And so this time we'll be asking, I'll allow it to come up first for you all. So here it is. So has your organization increased your cyber defenses because of the coronavirus pandemic? Yes, no, or don't know. So I'll pause there just for a moment to allow you to respond. So has your organization increased your cyber defenses because of the coronavirus pandemic? And so I think we can take that down now, and you'll see the result appear in just a moment. Right, so we've got quite a split here, an equal split, in fact, for yes and no, 46% on each of those, with a few people saying that they don't know. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce our next session, which is our third session of the day, and that's UK common claims and cyber challenges. And I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker for the day, Stephen Ridley, Cyber Underwriting Manager at Hiscox UK. Over to you, Steve.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you, Joe, for the intro. So as Joe just said, I'm the Cyber Underwriting Manager here for Hiscox in the UK. So what that means is that I'm responsible for setting our strategy around how we underwrite cyber risk in the UK, how we set our acceptance criteria, our pricing, our product development, all of that side of things. So right at the coalface of seeing this. So if we skip on to the next slide, please, we can then look at how the results of the poll compared to the Cyber Readiness Report around this cyber defense increase. And we've got the results here broken down by business size, and without knowing kind of the demographics of the people on the session here today, it probably looks like, again, it balances out fairly evenly with what we saw in the report overall. And again, probably unsurprisingly, slightly bigger companies enhancing their position here to a greater extent than the smaller businesses. So if we move on to the next slide, please. And again, please. So I'm sure the numbers here on this slide will come as no surprise to anyone. So in the report, we looked at the proportion of people who were working remotely and how that compared. So the left-hand charts are the total response, and then on the right-hand side is looking at the UK in particular. And you can see that the results are pretty much exactly the same across the board. But what is more interesting to my perspective is looking at kind of how that then breaks down into the underlying bits. So what is the actual impact of all of that? And as Gareth mentioned earlier, this is a substantial piece of research that's done. So 6,000 businesses in total surveyed, and about 1,000 of those in the UK. So we can get some really meaningful results from this. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we can see some of the other changes that have been made. And this is where some of the more interesting points start to come to life. And what I like to look at is where there are the most substantial differences between the UK and the rest of the population. So I think we'll call that teal turquoise bars are the UK results, and then the darker blue is the total. And the two that really stand out there are the reduced volume of IT changes and updates. And this can have both a positive and negative impact depending on the nature of those change. So one of the things that we see as being a particular driver of risk, or something that can lead to an increased chance of having claims, is a driving through of increased change from an IT perspective. That's when there is a risk for things to go wrong, for things to not be done quite correctly, for something to be missed, and that allow a way into a system for an attacker. So that can be a reduction of risk if we've seen less of that big upheaval of IT systems. But conversely, and back to one of the first points that Gareth made earlier on, if that reduced IT change is the ceasing of patching systems, not performing as much day-to-day maintenance of systems, then that can equally kind of increase the risk and lead to a greater chance of something going awry. So that's an interesting point that stood out to me. And then the other thing, which from experience we've seen in all kinds of areas, is this either addition of new e-commerce channels or expanding existing digital or e-commerce channels. With lots of businesses having to cease their general or their pre-existing business models, they're having to pivot all of a sudden and look at new ways of doing things. And this comes back to the previous point about the volume of IT change, and how delivering something new or massively ramping up what you have been doing in this digital space potentially leads to these issues around something not being developed as thoroughly as it might do, or something being delivered hastily and not having the ability to fully test it and make sure that all is running well. So those were two particular bits that stood out to me, as well as not as much in the way of increasing in adoption of cloud-based technologies, which was something that was slightly interesting. So move on to the next slide, please. Now, Gareth has already touched on the results from this slide, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but what we saw is that just over a third of businesses in the UK reported at least one attack. But then if we look at how that breaks down again, so we move on to the next slide, what we actually see is that where companies did suffer attack, 69% of them suffered more than one attack, with 11% suffering more than 15 attacks in the last 12 months. So this is a huge scale of incidents that we're seeing, and this has been an upward trend over the last few years, and well, evidently kind of a much more significant risk for businesses now. And if we move on to the next slide, please. Again, this compares the UK to the total survey population. And when Gareth was talking about the maturity model and the different areas that we look at, so it's people, process, and technology, one of the things that we saw throughout was that the UK scored much lower than our counterparts on the people metrics. And we see this come to bear from these results here, where actually a much greater proportion of incidents were driven by the employees, were driven by people. It was much less about servers being attacked or compromised, and much more about employees falling foul of phishing emails, again, the likes of which we've already mentioned here today. So it's still a point that that we need to be aware of now, and that need for training of employees and making sure that we are all playing our parts as custodians of a business's critical data, as to making sure that we're not the potential weak link in the chain. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll then look at kind of the outcomes of those attacks. So once an attack does take place, what is it that is then happening? And we see virus outbreaks and business email compromise as being the two biggest sources of incidents from the report. And this aligns fairly well with what we see from our own internal claims data. And actually, over the last few years, this business email compromise, so an email account being hacked and then used to carry out either further phishing attacks onto contacts within that mailbox, or more commonly trying to perform payment diversion fraud. So the criminals trying to insert themselves in the middle of a financial transaction and divert the funds for their own use. That has been the biggest source of claims for us in the UK over the last 3 or 4 years. But on the more positive side of things, the UK has been found to be one of the best countries from the 9 that were surveyed in actually managing to completely defend an attack. So in 13% of incidents, it was able to be successfully defended before any of these outcomes had been reached. I mean, there's still 87% of people then suffering one of these outcomes as a result, but good to see that we're able to be slightly ahead of the game. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll then start to look at the costs of these incidents. So within the report itself, we look at the mean cost, the median cost of these incidents. And you can see that over the last few years, this amount has leapt about a bit. So it was about 7,500 back in 2019, up to 35,000 for UK businesses last year, and then back down to 5,500 this year. But one of the challenges we have with this is that there is such a wide array of costs that can be incurred. If we look on the right-hand side here, you can see some of the largest costs that were reported within this. So this year was much lower for the UK, £500,000 as the largest incident that was reported within there. But just last year, £12 million was the biggest that was reported. And we see these orders of magnitude throughout the cost, and it can be, even for the smallest businesses, have wild swings in the amount that an incident can cost. And if we look at our own internal claims data, which is on the bottom row on the left-hand side there, if we look at the average claim cost, stripping out some of the outliers of like the larger claims, what we can see is there has been this steady increasing of cost over the last few years. These incidents are getting much more complicated to deal with, much more costly to deal with, and the ramifications are getting much more severe. And next slide, please. And we'll look at ransomware in particular, which Gareth has already touched on in a fair amount of detail. So not going to delve into this too much other than to look at these pie charts, which are looking at the proportion of companies that are paying claims where there has been a ransomware incident. So the one on the left, we're looking at the total reports, so 58% paid the ransom, which is level from the UK as well. But what we can see with the right-hand chart is for our own internal claims data from the UK perspective, when we've dealt with ransomware incidents, we've actually only paid or only had to pay the ransom in 7% of incidents. There's been a reasonable amount of coverage over the last couple of months, some high-profile people talking about how insurers are potentially fueling ransomware by insuring these ransom payments. But actually, that's not really what we're seeing. And from our perspective, cyber insurance can actually be a mitigator to having to pay that ransom, where we're able to engage the services and look at ways of getting around something without having that need to pay the ransom. So we're actually able to avoid paying that in the majority of instances. We've also got the number there of the largest ransom that was paid in the UK from the report. This isn't our internal data, and that's at £30,000. And again, we see quite wild swings with this. We've seen demands in the multi-millions of pounds. And it's another one of those where, to Gareth's point earlier, criminals are getting much more savvy about ransomware. It used to be a very highly commoditized business where it was an almost stack it high, sell it cheap style model, where you target as many companies as you can with a relatively small ransom demand and hope that a decent proportion will pay. Now it's becoming much more targeted, not in terms of criminals setting out and saying, I'm going to go after company X, but once criminals manage to gain access to a system, they're actually doing a lot more in the way of reconnaissance, working out what company it is they've managed to gain access to, what the revenue of that business is, how reliant they're likely to be on their system, and charging a ransom that they believe they will be able to gain based on that. Looking at what the impact of the systems being unavailable is, looking at what data they're able to extract and what the value of that data would be, what the reputational damage to the business would be if that data were to be released. So they're doing this in a much more specifically targeted way once they gain access to those systems. So that brings me to the end of this session. So I'll hand over to Joe to lead the next poll.
That's great. Thank you very much, Steve. And fascinating to hear you talk about the effect that IT changes can have and how that can increase risk and lead to a way in for an attacker, and really striking to see the number of attacks that individual companies can suffer and how many that can be in a single year. We have another poll for our attendees today, and this is our fifth poll of the day. You'll see it appear now. And so the question is, does your business have a standalone cyber insurance policy? Yes, no, or don't know. So we'll give you a moment to respond to that poll. And thank you to everyone who continues to share questions in the Q&A functions. We can see those come through. So we will be covering those after the next session, which is our final session in today's event. And so we're going to close the poll in just a second. We'll close it any moment now, and you'll see the result appear. So great. So we can see that about 36% have said yes, 44% have said no, and about 20% don't know at the moment. So very interesting data there. And as I say, we're moving into our last presentation of the day. And so I'm very pleased to hand back over to Stephen to deliver that session, and that is how to manage your cyber risk. So back over to you, Stephen.
Great, thanks, Joe. So we move on to the next slide, please. Again, just do the compare and contrast from the survey to the readiness report. So again, we can see that there is a slight uptick on the number of people who are saying that you have a standalone cyber policy. Hopefully, making use of the good deal that IoD members get with Hiscox, where so in the Cyber Readiness Report, we saw that 22% of companies in the UK said that they had a standalone policy, with another 33% saying that they had it as part of another policy. And I guess it'd just be a little bit of a watch out around that, having it as part of another policy, in that we've seen over time there perhaps being a misconception about the nature of cover that is afforded in other policies. What we're seeing now is there's a drive from insurers across the board to handle something that is known within the industry as silent cyber risk, and a move to try and look towards more specific cyber policy. So if you would fall into that bracket of having it as part of another policy, I would definitely be taking a look at that policy and speaking to your broker about it, and just making sure that you are kind of well protected. Because one of the things that Gareth mentioned earlier is we see that one of the ways that experts distinguish themselves from the novices is having cyber insurance as part of their whole incident response package. So if we move on, just 2 slides, I think, please. Yeah, there we go. So we're going to look at how organizations can build their resilience against cyber risk now. And one of the points that we touched on earlier was the proportion of IT spend that is now going on IT security, on cyber security. And here we look at how this has changed from year to year. So comparing 2020 to 2021, again, the paler blue being last year's results, and the darker blue for this year. So what the interesting thing from this slide to me is that we can see the smallest companies having made the most significant investments here, or made the biggest step change, both from the absolute amount that they're spending. So we can see right down at the bottom end there for the 1 to 9 employees. So they didn't even register on the chart in 2020, but now have a decent sized spend on there. And again, the 10 to 49, yeah, that's a significant increase proportionately from year on year. But then we get to this 50 to 1,000 company space, and that overall amount spent has actually reduced by quite a decent margin, albeit the proportion spent on cybersecurity has increased. So this might come back to that point that we looked at earlier, where the proportion of companies that had reduced their IT change. So whether that's something that is come to bear from those numbers there. But the big thing, I think, to me, is this big step up in that line from on the proportion of IT spend on cyber across the board, and particularly at that 10 to 49 employee space, where before they were lagging behind those upper employee bands, but now right up there alongside the 50 and upwards employees in terms of that proportion that is being spent. For the very smallest companies, still that step below, but good to see that big enhancement year on year all the same. So if we move on to the next slide, please, we'll then look at what the plans are for the coming 12 months. So here we ask, where is spending going to increase? And one of the big things that stands out here, so we have 2020 on the right hand side, 2021 on the left, and we're comparing the experts to the novices. And the thing here that stands out to me is the gap in 2021 between the experts and the novices. So there's this continued drive from the experts to carry on investing in their systems and their processes across the board. Almost all of these metrics are seeing kind of these big increases still. But from the novices side of things, there is a bit of a lag behind on that, perhaps unsurprisingly, but still it's something that is that still exists. And again, coming back to one of the points made earlier about the people side of things, one of the areas where that gap is biggest is around this cybersecurity training for employees. So feels like there's still a bit of a way to go for business to realize and acknowledge that employee training is a really critical part of that. It's something that can be quite easily overlooked, I think, but it is a fundamental element of making sure that the business is prepared for cyber incidents. And if we move on to the next slide, please, which is the final one from me, we'll look at what are the main points that we can learn from the experts in minimizing cyber risk. The first one is to share the risk. This comes back to what we said before, that almost half of experts have cyber insurance as part of their arsenal in being able to deal with cyber incidents effectively, with that being significantly lower, only 11% amongst novices. It's then about making somebody responsible. Half of firms, again, have somebody who is responsible for that cybersecurity, but 45% of novices don't have anyone at all responsible for cybersecurity, no defined role for cybersecurity. So having somebody who has that accountability, that responsibility is a focal point for all things cybersecurity, is a really critical element to it. Coming back to the point around vulnerabilities, making sure that is something that is dealt with as quickly as possible and is done in a repeatable way is really fundamental, with 3/4 of experts telling us that they are able to deal with that patch management in a quick and effective way. And finally, backup data, and preferably off-site as well. So experts were more likely to repel all of the attacks that they had before they dealt with any damage, and only 1 in 7 said that they had had ransomware, or 1 in 7 with ransomware attacks had no financial impact whatsoever, because they're able to reinstate from these backups. It is a really critical part to cybersecurity. And the final thing that I would add to this, which isn't on the slide as well, is make use of multi-factor authentication in any situation where you can do. We mentioned earlier that business email compromise is one of the key causes of loss in both the Cyber Readiness Report and our own internal claims data. And having multi-factor authentication in place would have prevented almost all of those, certainly the ones that we see internally. So again, something that I would really encourage you to make full use of as much as you possibly can. So I'll hand back to Joe for the Q&A.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Gareth. Thank you both very much for those excellent sessions. And so now we have our Q&A. We have just under 10 minutes left, so we're on schedule at the moment, but we will be, we may not get to all the questions. Thank you very much for all the questions, but we'll cover as many as we possibly can. So just to start, we've been asked about the content, if we'll be sharing that. So we will be sharing a recording of today's session with everyone who's booked on. So don't worry at all, you'll be able to watch any of this back at your own leisure. And so one of the questions here, first questions from one of our members, is on the topic of, slightly technical question, on the topic of exchange and patch level. Assuming the customers know the risk of not staying on top of patching, what are the reasons customers don't patch? Why do they not always patch?
So I'll take that one. It's a fair question. It would seem like a fairly obvious thing about why you wouldn't patch. I think there's two bits there. Assuming the customer know the risk of not staying on top of patching, I think that's a somewhat dangerous assumption. Maybe some customers believe the systems get patched automatically, or they're protected by the firewall, or some other reason. The reasons not to patch, I mean, there aren't any good ones. There are some pragmatic ones in there. Obviously, most patches will require a restart, much like your iPhone or Mac does. So you need to agree business downtime. So maybe you run an online e-commerce platform that's difficult to get downtime for, or just you need to patch in a non-production environment to test it first before you want to launch it into production. Quite often with things like Exchange, it has integrations with other systems. So maybe it's a document management system or a CRM system. So that needs patching, or that needs to come down at the same time. And then there's the end user piece to it. So maybe there's a requirement to update the desktop component. So maybe it's Outlook that needs upgrading as well, which is part of a wider upgrade that then needs a Windows upgrade, and then the cost can spiral. So there's no sort of there's no cyber reason that you wouldn't do it, but there are some sort of operational and IT reasons. Maybe it's a budgeting issue, maybe there's a timing issue. So, yeah, it's not impossible to get on top of those.
Great, thank you, Gareth. That's great. Another member writes that it's established that cyber attacks have quadrupled since the pandemic and exposed a huge amount of data. How have authorities addressed the approvable fines to companies attacked in line with GDPR? So GDPR, of course, being relatively new legislation in the past few years, it's, I imagine, had a significant impact on those organizations that have sadly suffered from cyber breaches and particularly data theft. Is there anything? Is this something that you guys have done much research around as part of the Cyber Readiness Report?
Yeah, so I'll take this one. So it's not something that we cover off as part of the Readiness Report in particular. I think one of the things that I would say, which is more anecdotal, I guess, is that the ICO does seem to be reticent, probably the wrong word, but only or kind of making scant use of their ability to levy fines. So there's been only a very small number of instances where they have levied fines, particularly where the fine is being levied because of a cyber attack or data breach incident. And those have typically been for the really, really large incidents. Most of the kind of their efforts around fining companies have been where there's been a business practice that just contravenes the law. So where companies are spam texting or calling, misusing people's data for marketing purposes, things such as that. Certainly on all of the incidents that we've dealt with internally, I'm not aware of any incident where one of our clients has been the victim of a cyber attack and they have subsequently been fined by the ICO.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Stephen. I think we have time for one more question here. And as I say, please do get in touch with us afterwards with any questions you'd like us to address later on. And this question is from Philip, who asks if we have any insight on the typical length of time from successful ransomware attacks to a ransom demand. So I suppose what that is there a general sort of situation as to how that looks or what the timescale might be in that scenario?
So I think Steve may well have a view on this as well, but it's difficult to say is the honest answer. I mean, we've seen cases where attackers have gone from the first element of access, so a phishing attack or the initial compromise, to having full what we call domain administration, so widespread high-level access in 4 hours. So it's conceivable that it happens very quickly, but typically we see this in days or weeks, depending on size of the organization. As Steve was saying earlier, sadly the attackers are getting much more savvy. They'll navigate around to often they'll go to the HR records, so they can take personal records of the customer to try and exert pressure on the customer, from a GDPR perspective, as we just talked about, or they'll go to the financial records to look at turnover, to work out how many customers they had, what the profitability was last year. We've seen it in text chats between the attackers and the victim saying, we know you made $7 million last year, so you can pay a £2 million ransom. So they are taking the time to find data and quite often exfiltrate that data. So I think probably minimum is a day, and the maximum is about 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the size of the organization. But I would suggest less than a week before as the time between the initial compromise and sadly you receiving that email saying your data's been encrypted.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one further question. I'll squeeze one in because we have one moment before I bring back up the slides again. And the question is, do I really need cyber insurance if I'm investing in the appropriate technology and people to manage my cyber risk? Would either of you like to take that question?
Yeah, so and of course I'm going to say yes. Right? But in all seriousness, I think, so we see that even the most technologically sophisticated companies around the world can find themselves falling foul of incidents, and insurance should only ever be a backstop, right? So cyber insurance should never be your primary kind of way of, or insurance full stop should never be your primary way of mitigating any form of risk. But it has its part to play once you've gone through all of the other elements of risk management. So once you've worked out what risk you can get rid of, what you're kind of willing to retain yourself, once you've gone through all of that, insurance is then there as a cost-effective way of mitigating that residual risk that is there, and that applies equally to cyber insurance as anything else. But where cyber insurance stands itself apart from other forms of insurance, which are typically there to hand over a check if something goes wrong, they're there to reimburse you for a financial loss in the event of an incident. What cyber insurance does is actually provides the full incident response service. So whereas if your building catches a light, you call the fire brigade to come and put the fire out, and then you go to your insurers to pay the cost of putting it right. In the world of cyber, your insurance policy provides the fire brigade. So we provide the IT forensics companies, the legal experts, all of that wraparound solution to effectively manage an incident, rather than just providing money to put it right once it's happened.
That's very helpful analogy. It'll certainly be one I'll remember, actually. So thank you, Stephen. A huge thank you to Gareth and Stephen today, and thank you to everyone at home who's joined. If we could just bring back the slides for a moment. We have some contact details here for you, so that we're very proud of the work we do with Hiscox, and if you'd like more information on that, there's a link there. It's also a phone number you can call, and as you know, as an IoD member, you benefit from a discount on the standard rates over at Hiscox. So please feel free to take a screen grab just here, but of course you'll be receiving this recording later on as well. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. That's my email address there. So really just to say a huge thank you. We have run over by just a minute, so apologies there, but thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found that helpful. I certainly have, and I wish you a pleasant rest of the week. Thank you very much.